We are back. If you're anything like me, you're sick of hearing lies when it came to the pandemic. You know, there are still people out there that want to put a mask on your face. They want to inject you with a drug. They want to force you to take a mandate, right? And you have to think, well, thank God we're in Texas. It wasn't as bad here. Could have been better. Could have been worse, but could have been better, right? Obviously, you're probably not a big fan of Dr. Anthony Fauci, but you forget sometimes who lived right in our own backyard. Still lives here. Remember that? How many of you are familiar with the name Dr. Peter Hotez? If you regularly watch CNN, you know all about Peter Hotez. Peter Hotez is an authoritarian leftist. He claims to be a vaccinologist. And he claims, a local medical guy, claims to be for the vaccine mandates, for the vaccinations, for the forcible injections, but claims to be against Big Pharma. Have you ever heard him talk about this? If you follow the guy on Twitter, this is one of Lena Hidalgo's closest allies in the local medical community. You've heard him talk about this stuff before. He's like, no, we're giving you the alternative to Big Pharma. We're supplying people with cheap alternatives to the vaccine. It's like, cheap alternatives to the vaccine? The vaccine that the government gave us, quote unquote, for free? Well, yeah, that's what he claims to do. Peter Hotez is not a good guy. Honestly, I don't think we've spent enough time on this radio show talking about Peter Hotez. So why don't we do that right now? Let's just for a change of pace here. You know, before everybody forgets about what happened during the pandemic. And there's a local activist, a guy named Derrick Broze. You've heard him on the show before. He ran for mayor 4 years ago against a whole bunch of people. Dwight Boykins, Tony Busby, Bill King, and of course the person we ended up getting, Sylvester Turner. Well, now we're getting back into mayoral election season here in Houston. And one activist, a guy that's worked very hard to expose people like Lena Hidalgo, Peter Hotez, for example, he's running again. Now, Derrick Broze is on the line. Derrick, you are an interesting character. And I don't mean that in an insulting way. I'm an interesting character. But you are not a conventional politician. Some people find you to be a little off-putting, maybe a little unusual, you know, and you're not a textbook conservative, but you seem to be a big critic of what local liberals are doing. Can you speak to that for a second?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for having me on. And I don't take it as an insult to be called interesting. I appreciate that. My work has focused on trying to expose corruption at the local level, national, international level. You mentioned Sylvester Turner. I've been on him for years, and I've been calling out corruption since before the previous election in 2019. And then after that, obviously, we came right into the COVID era, and there was a lot of, I'll just say insanity happening from government officials, even on the local level. Like you said, Texas wasn't the worst place. Could have been better, but it wasn't the worst place. But we did have local officials in the city of Houston and in Harris County, Lena Hidalgo, Sylvester Turner, Dr. David Pearce, who is the head of the Houston Health Department, and then Dr. Peter Hotez, who, even though he doesn't work for the city, he's a doctor in the city. And as you mentioned, he's on CNN, or he was on CNN every week during COVID, and his words were definitely given a lot of weight. So just as I did before the 2019 race, and as I've done since then and will continue to do, I try to call out corruption wherever I see it. You know, I have my views that could fit in a conservative box, and I have other views that could be called maybe other labels, but ultimately I just try to follow the corruption wherever it's going.
Okay, so Peter Hotez, I want to talk to you about the work you've done investigating Lena Hidalgo, but first let's talk about Peter Hotez. Peter Hotez claims to be against Big Pharma. He brands himself, he markets himself as like your hometown vaccination guy. He's even been involved in producing some vaccines, if I'm not mistaken, and supplying them to third world countries. It sounds good, right? If you don't know what the vaccines is, if you don't know what's in the injection. But as you have figured out with some of the work you've been doing, he has lots of Big Pharma connections. He's branded himself as the opposite of what he actually is.
Yeah, that's 100% correct. He tries to say that there's no conflicts of interest between his research and Big Pharma, the pharmaceutical industry, but that's really let's just call it what it is. It's a lie, because you can go back, as I have done, and another great journalist, Dan Cohen, did a great investigation.
Yeah.
I spoke with him a couple months back. He looked at, and this is all public record, it's just nobody has really called out Hotez on it, and he needs to be called out more often. But his entire career is dependent on people like Bill Gates and Anthony Fauci. He has a relationship with them going back several decades. And as you mentioned, he has been pushing for years now, for decades now, to get vaccinations into young African children for what he calls neglected tropical diseases, which really, when you look at it, he essentially created a whole new class of diseases that he claims we need vaccinations for. And so through working with Bill Gates and his foundation and working with Dr. Fauci and just kind of ingratiating himself into the pharmaceutical and medical establishment, he's been able to turn this idea that there are these neglected tropical diseases, which a couple of decades ago, nobody was paying attention and nobody thought were a problem. Hotez, though, has really pushed it and made it now an entire industry of getting these various vaccinations for these claimed diseases that they claim are a threat to African children and children in developing countries, and just built an entire industry around it. So, I mean, his claims that he has no relationship to Big Pharma is absolutely false.
Yeah, I see him say that on Twitter all the time. People don't realize this. People want to forget about the pandemic. These guys are still using the tools that they acquired during the pandemic, the power they acquired as we move into the next election here, and not just the presidential election next year, but the mayoral election this year. You know, Lena Hidalgo not going anywhere. And, of course, her influence on this mayoral election this year is very concerning to me. The people she's aligned herself with, Sheila Jackson Lee, for example. You actually have a report on your website that talks about some of the billionaires that are connected to Lena Hidalgo. Lena Hidalgo adamantly attacked her opponent in the last election, suggesting that just big money from outside the city was funding her whole campaign. Lena Hidalgo's campaign was funded by big money outside the city. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, and I want to say this, that, you know, personally for me, my views are I don't have an issue with people who have money. So bringing up the billionaire status isn't, just like you. It's not just like, oh, this rich person's doing something. But I think it is important to pay attention to, obviously, the influence of money, and specifically when it's coming from somebody like Lena Hidalgo, who does label herself as like a liberal or progressive, a leftist. And those are the kind of people who typically say, oh, we need to get, money out of politics and stay away from billionaires. Maybe they're the kind of people that make fun of or attack Elon Musk for having money, when she's doing the very same thing. And so what I want to mention is that Lena Hidalgo, for one, I mean, again, her entire history is not what she tries to frame it as. She comes from a very wealthy family. Again, nothing wrong with that wealth, but she's been being groomed for decades now. She was involved in this organization, went to school, and was basically trained at this organization called the National Hispanic Institute, which is funded by British Petroleum, Facebook, Wells Fargo, AT&T, State Farm, a bunch of other law firms and organizations. And it seems like a lot of the people who go through that school, they end up getting into politics, particularly progressive politics, and they make a lot of friendly connections. And one of those connections that Hidalgo has made was from the Arnold family, a local Houstonian who is a billionaire. His name's Kurt Arnold. He's part of the Arnold and Itkin law firm, personal injury law firm. Kurt Arnold is not only given the maximum of $10,000 that he could give as an individual to Lena Hidalgo, but he is also given to many other Democratic Party figures and the DNC itself. And his foundation, the Arnold Foundation, is involved in they call it Arnold Ventures, a for-profit corporation by him and his wife. They helped fund what's called the Texas Policy Lab. And when you dig into what the Texas Policy Lab is, it's actually this organization that's based in Rice University, funded by the Arnolds, founded in September 2018 with $6 million grant. And it is this Texas Policy Lab that actually came up with the entire Harris County COVID response. That they wanted lockdowns. Hidalgo was trying to get stay-at-home orders, which are basically lockdowns. And she's been quoted several times in the Chronicle saying, "I get my advice from doctors and the folks at Rice University, the Texas Policy Lab, epidemiologists have been advising me since the very beginning." So when you really start to dig into this, her claim of just kind of being she kind of has this AOC story that once Trump came into office, she just had to stand up and, run for office. But really, she's been being groomed for decades through her schooling, her education, her connections, the Democratic Party. And then she comes into office, and then COVID happens. And through this billionaire-funded organization, basically led the whole COVID response. And then she, again, wanted lockdowns. Her and Mayor Turner kind of partnered together, and they called it necessary civil disobedience, trying to resist Governor Abbott's orders not to initiate lockdowns and mask orders. And I should say that even though she's not in the mayoral race, like you said, she does have influence. Her voice does matter. And she's good friends with Sylvester Turner, who thankfully is on his way out. And he used the only power he did, and he forced all the city employees to be either vaccinated or to get a test every other week. So, these connections do matter between Hotez, Hidalgo, and Turner. And again, Dr. David Pearce, who is in the health department. And like you said, these people are still there. We shouldn't forget and move on. And that's part of the reason why I'm running in 2019 is to really call out this failed handling of COVID in Harris County and Houston, and to make sure that these officials who are still there get called out.
You mean 2023?
Yeah, 2023.
Yeah, I thought you said 2019. Well, you ran in 2019. And anybody just turning the radio on, you may remember Derrick Broze from the 2019 mayoral race, as you just pointed out. Derrick, you are, like I said, you're an interesting character in a political race like this. You are, you align yourself with anarchists. You have a news website called, what is it, the Total Consciousness Network, that features like a guy meditating on top of a pyramid. And then when you click the website, it sort of seems to be like a combination of news that right-wing people would be interested in, and then, stuff that's sort of way out there by right-wing standards or traditional conservative standards. I'm just trying to paint a picture for the listeners here. I'm not vilifying you or anything. I'm just I like putting people in a box so people kind of know what the category is for Derrick Broze's brand. One of the brands you're up against is Sheila Jackson Lee. I don't think I have to explain who she is. Look, Derrick, you and I may not be exactly politically aligned 100%, but boy, I bet I have way more in common with you than her. The rumor is that she's going to she's running for mayor. Her big announcement comes tomorrow night. There's a big event. And then the person that's going to replace her in Congress is Sylvester Turner. He's going to run in her district. That rumor doesn't surprise me at all. I completely believe not only that she could win the race, believe me, I don't want her to, but that he will win that district, and that's where we're going to be in a couple years. Any thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, that's a horrifying thought. I hadn't heard that rumor. I will say again, I don't mind the kind of descriptive for the audience. If anybody is interested in checking out my work, the website's theconsciousresistance.com for my journalism. And my name, Derrick Broze, Derrick, Broze, BROZE.com for my mayoral campaign.
Broze is such a great last name for a politician, because you could put that on a shirt.
Broze for Broze. We need Broze for Broze.
All right.
But yeah, I agree with your assessment, man, that Sheila Jackson Lee is now that she's stepping into the race, is obviously she's given, because of her reputation, the forerunner, the front runner. I personally, I do well in underdog fights. I enjoyed it in 2019, and as I hope we'll talk about in a moment, some of the things I talked about in 2019 actually ended up and are continuing to influence the city. Like, I was warning about vaccine mandates in 2019 before COVID, and that became a big issue that a lot of people were concerned about. So I don't really mind, seeing Sheila Jackson Lee and these politicians step into the race. We know what they're about. The beautiful thing about a politician being in office that long, it means they've made a lot of mistakes, and it's going to be really fun for me when I'm at the forums and debates, and I have this entire history to call her out and call out, the other leading candidates, because all the leading candidates who have raised millions of dollars all have deep ties to the Democratic Party, and they represent nothing new, nothing, that anybody in Houston, I think, who, whether conservative or just independent, who wants real change and wants to address the flooding and wants to address the crime, and not just say, let's throw money at it. Let's create new taxes. Let's create new departments. I think people would be interested to see what we're talking about and what we're doing. So to me, that idea, again, it's a horrifying idea that her and Turner could just switch places. But yeah, she did step into the race. And now you had one of the other gentlemen, Chris Hollins. He ended his campaign. He's a black gentleman.
Right.
There's another
that's
black
a big,
woman,
Derrick,
Amanda Edwards.
That's a big deal. The second that she announced her candidacy, somebody called him, nobody knows who it was, Rodney Ellis, and told him to drop out, and then he did. Doesn't that just prove my point? Like, these it's a crime syndicate. Hey, we got a break. We went long on this break with this segment. But Derrick, you're an interesting guy. I hope to have you back again as we move into this mayoral election. Guys, this is it. You're all sick and tired of hearing about elections. Well, guess what? The fight for Houston happens now. Whitmire, Sheila Jackson Lee. There's a rumor that Tony Busby could run. And of course, Derrick Broze. Derrick Broze is the wild card candidate. But check out his website, DerrickBroze.com. Quick break. We'll be right back.